This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com. As part of our ongoing series on financial repression, I have the Honorable John Browne joining us. John is a senior economic consultant for Pacific Capital and is a distinguished former member of the British Parliament.
Hello, Gordon. Good morning.
Well, I'm so glad you could join us. I've been reading a number of your articles for some time now, and I really hope we have to discuss those articles. Maybe, John, for those that aren't familiar with your background, you could just give a brief overview of some of the things you've been involved with.
Well, I was born and raised in England, went to school in England and to the military academy at Sandhurst, served in the Royal Guard for about 10 years, went to Harvard Business School and then worked with Morgan Stanley in New York, and then became a director of Middle East operations of a London-based merchant bank, or investment bank rather, and then went into Parliament and then to the United States when we threatened of the European Union. I thought I'd better get away before the new Euro-Soviet came, to free enterprise. But of course, those were in the days when we had some real free enterprise in America too. And things have changed somewhat. And so here I am, as you said, working with, I'm a columnist at the Pittsburgh Tribune Review, and I'm with Euro-Pacific Capital.
You know, John, I have a similar background in that I'm an immigrant to America because I wanted to start a business. The venture capital was here as a pure capitalist economy, and I'm getting concerned on what I'm seeing going on. And this whole discussion we're going to talk about financial repression is one of my concerns and is the reason why we're doing this. Could you explain in your own words what this concept of financial repression means to you, or how you would define it?
Really, it's the financial repression of the ordinary individual in America. And it's happening through three main avenues or arteries, really. First of all, politically, the government is increasing its power almost every day and repressing the power of the individual, particularly the rights of the individual, always, of course, under the guise that we're out to help you. Reagan said, as President Ronald Reagan, the Great, in my view, said, you know, the worst you can hear is we're here from the government to help you. And this is happening a lot. I think there's abuse. Every day you see further abuse of government power. And of course, statistics are published that are highly questionable, if not false. For example, growth rates, inflation rates, unemployment rates are all highly questionable and confusing people, and really a political abuse. And people are being forced now. We hear today even something I've thought of long ago is being forced out of using cash.
Yes.
To get more and more onto paper, so more and more easily tracked every single expenditure you make. And that legal tender is going to be denied. It won't be legal tender anymore. Everyone's able to force you to pay by electronic means or any other means, but not using cash. So that's a big encroachment on individual people. Second one is economically. I mean, we've had an enormous injection, just unprecedented injection of cash into the economy with a $3.8 trillion quantitative easing program. And I would remind you, of course, listeners, that how big a trillion is. If I had, or you had, $1 trillion in $1 bills in a great warehouse and you invited me to look at the huge pile, and then afterwards, after I left, you thought, well, God, John left with rather bulging pockets. I better check it and count them. Counting $1 note per second 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would take you 31,500 years to count to a trillion. I mean, that's the staggering size. A trillion is 31,500 years ago. And so $1 trillion, we've got 3.8 trillion injected into the economy, an unprecedented amount. It's an experiment. I mean, it was started, the idea of quantitative easing was started by initiated by the Bank of Japan several years ago, almost a decade more, 2 decades ago. And studying it, the Bank of Japan said it's not going to work. Politicians in Japan insisted on them doing it. And after 2 decades, it still hasn't worked. Now we're doing it on a very grand scale without a pilot scheme. No, it just straight into a thing, unproven thing, but a massive size. And of course, it's created a huge amount of liquidity such that you've almost got a liquidity trap, which I will explain in a minute. And of course, values are shrinking and unseen. It's hard to test. I mean, if you look at a bond with even in America going out 5 years now to get a real nominal rate of return, let alone a real rate of inflation. If you took inflation at 1.8%, even the 10-year bond is hovering at 0. But in Switzerland, you can go out over 10, almost to 20 years with negative rates. I mean, this is a major distortion and helping to crush savers. I mean, if 10 countries have now got negative short-term interest rates, how does a manager or a mutual fund manager, or all these people, get a return for the or for the pension for their beneficiaries? When you've got all this situation in prime government bonds of negative interest, you have to go more and more risky bonds and more risky ventures to get any positive return. And so in effect, crushing the saver. And of course, there's now a huge disconnect in the economy. I mean, we have financial assets which have been boosted no end by quantitative easing and zero interest rates because it's cheap to borrow. So you can not only invest in financial assets, but borrow almost paying nothing. And soon the lender's going to be paying you to borrow the money and invest all the proceeds in financial assets. So they've gone booming up. Markets, bond markets, historic levels. And yet the economy, the underlying economy where the value is merely spluttering along. And the final way, of course, is the financial thing of ZIRP, or zero interest rate policy. This is crushing savers. And of course, it's savings that form investment for the future, to start new companies. And huge percentages, 62% of employment comes from small businesses. And to start these small businesses, in other words, create jobs, and through the wages that are paid in those jobs, consumer demand, and therefore a growing economy, you have to encourage the formation of small business. Well, first of all, that needs capital. Now, if savings are crushed, there's a disincentive to invest in business. And even when you do it, now you start increasing regulations and things like that that are absolutely killing not only the consumer, the saver, but the incentive to start a small business, which is the key to the creation of jobs, which is key to the creation of income, which is then key to savings and investment and growth in the economy. So it's all being killed by these policies. I don't think that the central bank is necessarily evil. I just think it's unbelievably irresponsible to have gone on these huge programs without testing them out. And now I think we're seeing a situation which you could call a liquidity trap. Fed is facing. There's so much money around that if they start to raise interest rates, they're going to discourage people even more from spending, because ordinary individuals have low wages. Their wages have been flat for 10 or 6 years at least, flat, and yet taxes are going up, not the rate of income tax, but the number of taxes. Obamacare contains a number of hidden taxes in it, for example. And then charges. You know, we used to get a driving license because you were paying your taxes. Now you have to pay extra to get the license. You go to a company, you have to pay extra to get them to do anything. and a bank. I mean, you got bank services because you were lending their money to them and they were earning money off it. Now you pay service charges for everything at a bank. And so cost of living outside the conventional CPI, Consumer Purchasing Index, is rising fast and squeezing individuals even further. So now in these circumstances, when in the old circumstances, under normal conditions, if a central bank lowered interest rates and pushed money into the economy, it grew. Consumers started to benefit and they started to buy things, and companies started to expand and create jobs, which meant wages, and then consumer demand. It grew, but now nothing's happening. And the reason, and they're pushing on a string, because it's not liquidity that matters, it's wages, it's income that's missing. And how does the Fed create income without actually giving you and me and our listeners cash in the post? Just sending us checks is the way to do it, but they're not putting it into banks and into the government. The government spends in trillions of dollars, almost $2 trillion deficit this year, let alone, and a government debt standing at approaching $18 trillion, a staggering sum of money, which can never be repaid. So now we're being asked to invest in government securities at negative interest rates, in other words, paying the government to take our money, knowing that the government can never repay all this money. I mean, if you wanted a definition of a Ponzi scheme, that's it. Have to get more people to lend them money in order to repay the interest on those that have lent, but they're never going to repay the capital.
John, I really agree with many of your points, if not all of the points. We have gutted in America the middle class, and therefore they're the ones that create the income and therefore the savings. And my close associate, Richard Duncan, argues that we no longer have a functioning capitalist system. And he's not trying to be negative. He's pointing out that, in fact, capitalism is about savings that are reinvested into productive assets. And we're not doing that anymore. We are a 70% consumption economy, and in fact, we're using credit to create more consumption. The problem with consumption is it doesn't generate free discounted cash flow. And the proof of that is that last quarter, 90% of all profits went back into buybacks, financial engineering, and dividends. That leaves no money to invest in capital improvements, which create jobs, and without job growth, there's no income. So we're not investing in our society, and it shows itself in the top line growth. Revenues are falling steadily, and real disposable income is falling. Do you agree with what I'm saying, or am I off track there?
Absolutely, I agree with everything you're saying. I mean, it's absolutely right. And of course, it starts at the top. I mean, here we have a government without a real budget, which spends and spends and spends, but it does not spend on investment in infrastructure and making us a more high-tech or a better largesse to people. Excuse me, I'm just going to get that telephone out of the way. Look, 1 second. Hello?
Hello?
I need to tell our listeners that you're on standby right now in case we have a new baby in Britain and you may be interviewed about it, right?
That's correct. I stand by with 2 different channels.
Just so our listeners know what's going on here, John. So we're on baby watch here as we're talking. But maybe time this video is released, we will have some news. I don't know.
That's right.
But John, what is fundamentally driving these policies by our government? I don't believe it's devious, but I believe they're being forced into policies that are terribly flawed.
That's where I disagree. I'm afraid at the very top, I believe it's devious.
Okay.
If you join all the dots together, I cannot help but feel it's by accident. It's by design. And I think the president wants to distribute American wealth around America, but even worse, to distribute American wealth around the world. And that's killing the economy, and it's killing America. And so I'm afraid I disagree with you there. But I mean, as far as the consumer goes, the ordinary consumer is suffering. The middle class, which, as you rightly point out, are the ones their money, but try to save, and then to invest, which gives them the return on the investment and extra income, and then they invest more and save more and invest more. That's how economies grow. And the middle class, above all, are being crushed because the very poor are looked after by the state. It's the middle class that don't qualify for some of these state benefits and things like that, even for mortgage reassessment of the interest rate on a mortgage and things like that, renegotiation. They don't qualify. So they're being absolutely crushed, and they're the savers, which are future investment in companies and therefore jobs and therefore income and therefore consumer demand and growing economy and prosperity for all, being killed at source.
We're killing the goose, the golden goose. Is that the old expression?
Yes, but we're not doing it in a humane way. We're just slowly strangling the goose.
The ones that are suffering more than the middle class, there is a group, and it's called the pensioners and the elderly, who put aside money to retire on, and we're told to budget maybe 6% on their bonds, and needless to say, that was, a while ago, and they're not getting it, and they have no recourse. There's nothing they can do about it right now. And these are the ones that built America.
Absolutely right. These are the people who served America
exactly.
in the wars. In the wars, they served America by working hard and saving, and now they're on retirement, and now they're being absolutely crucified. And as I said, when a bond comes due, or for repayment, a corporate bond or whatever, they're paid off, and the money, then they want to reinvest it, and maybe it was returning, as you say, 6%. And now it's returning. They've got to give the money away and pay to have it stored. It's negative interest rates. And the average pension fund and retirement fund works on an annuity basis of 7% return. Well, that today is pie in the sky. So this problem has only just started. When some of the longer term bonds come due and they're paid off, and then the cash is there for reinvestment and can only invest in at negative interest rates, that's when the real trouble is going to start. And of course, we've only seen the beginnings of that. It's yet to get much more severe.
Your analysis earlier of what $1 trillion is, I was interviewing Dr. Lawrence Kutlikoff here at the University of Boston, and he testified before Congress that the fiscal gap is $210 trillion. $210 trillion. And he's had, I think he claimed 500 economists sign off on his numbers of how he put it together. And the unfunded entitlement programs right now are closer to 84 trillion. They're 84 trillion. It's unfundable. We can't grow our way out of this. So there's a problem of significant proportions coming. Would you agree? In some fashion.
Huge problem. But then, of course, you've got, again, to get back to your very interesting question of whether it's by design or not. By accident, well, that's not so bad. But what it means is everyone's going to be financially crushed. When these financial markets crash, that'll hit even the rich very hard as well, who've benefited enormously, particularly those who've borrowed to invest and are highly leveraged on margin and things like that. They're going to be really hit too. It means that everyone's going to look towards the government for a solution. And that's when you have totalitarian governments come in, when people are absolutely desperate. It happened in Germany between the wars, and you've got the fascist party and Hitler. Everywhere where there's total chaos, people are prepared to vote for anybody who can sort the situation out, because they're literally starving, and anything to get food and shelter and vote for them. And that's how totalitarian governments come in, and that's the big danger. Short of that, we have one option, in my view. The only way in which you will have politicians that are going to prepare to put their country before themselves and their party is by having single-term politicians. And that is very difficult, because the present parliament, Congress and things like that will not vote for that, because turkeys don't vote for an early Christmas. And so they won't vote for it. But the citizen has to do it by having people stand for Republican or Democrat or whatever party it's going to be for a single term, and then getting the votes. The only solution before you get totalitarian government taking over after chaos is single-term politicians. And that's, of course, up to us. The question is, will we do it? Or are we going to be tempted to vote for the same old Republican or Democratic Party again, the ones that have steered us into this problem? Both parties. It's not just one party. It's happened enormously in the last few years under the Democrat Party, but basically Republicans and Democrats are both guilty of steering the country absolutely downward, on a downward path.
I look at it as having a choice between whether you want the Gambinos or the Gaudis running it, but that's the choice that you have.
Exactly.
And it's one or the other, and neither one are too enticing right now. But John, I want to switch gears a little bit, and because you wrote a great paper on the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. What does that mean longer term to America and the dollar?
Well, as I think it was Alan Greenspan said, of course, America has the great advantage of being able to use the printing press for money. And it does. When it took over from sterling finally at Bretton Woods in July of 1944, it was labeled as the reserve currency of the world, the international reserve currency, and therefore everything was priced in dollars. I mean, today, even if you want to buy hog's bellies and you're Swiss, you have to change your Swiss francs into dollars to buy the hog's bellies in Chicago on the exchange. I'm talking about big deals, of course. And so it puts a floor under the US dollar, and that's been enjoyed for decades now. America can basically set interest rates around the world to its own advantage, what suits the American economy, regardless of how it suits or doesn't suit other economies, and it's kept a floor under its currency. And since Nixon broke, a Republican by the way, broke the gold window in August of 1971, the dollar has just taken off on its second great inflation and debasement, in other words. And even now, the Fed is looking for 2% a year debasement, of stealing your money at 2% a year, just 2%. It's created a feeling in the rest of the world of deep resentment and of competition. And of course, China is one of these people. And China says, why should we kowtow to America? Why can't we create another international currency, possibly linked to gold, which holds its value for savers? And so they're trying to erode the international currency status of the US dollar. And one step, just one step, is this new infrastructure bank in the Far East. Amazingly, countries like Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Australia, Japan have joined. And what this says to me is, my gosh, a lot of people are losing faith in American rule.
It wasn't just that they joined, John, in my mind. It was that all 57 of them wanted to be charter members. And this was after threat by the U.S. government to specifically Australia, specifically the UK, in the early stages not to join it. And they said no, and away they went. And now, and the U.S. has lost tremendous credibility around the world. And I think it was, in many ways, an anti-U.S. policy pushback. It was almost a mutiny in many ways.
I do agree with your reasoning, but I don't agree with your conclusion. I don't think it's yet a mutiny. Okay. It's discontent. It's discontent. It's people complaining about the grub on the ship. They're not actually slaughtering.
They're not mutinying yet. They're just grumbling. Okay.
They're not grumbling. And they're trying to say this is too much. American foreign policy in the Middle East appears to them to be absolutely chaotic. Its monetary policy, they feel, is ruining not just the American economy, but the world economy. Just recently, you've got, after resistance for years by the Germans, now the ECB, the European Central Bank, has joined in this QE craze as well. And of course, markets are booming and everyone's finding it. Stock markets and bond markets in Europe are booming because this is what all that money goes to financial assets. It doesn't go to people, it goes to financial assets. And the rich become super rich, and the super rich beyond. And the poor get poorer, and the middle class are crushed in the middle.
John, we got financial assets setting records on an almost daily basis. Yet we just find out the GE has bailed on GE Capital, took a $13 billion charge, I might add. What's behind that? What would prompt them, do you think, to bail at this point in time?
Well, I have no inside information about that. It could be that they don't see the banking industry as being a very healthy business to be in and is fraught with risk. It is, one does know for a fact, since Dodd-Frank, of course, huge numbers of regulations which are killing regional banks. And it was regional small banks in America that knew the people in their town or their village. And so when they lent, as J.P. Morgan said once very famously, the ability to repay a loan is entirely secondary to the willingness. Therefore, know your customer. And whereas one chap with a big company might not get a loan, a tiny little company might get the loan because they trust the entrepreneur to pay it back. And so the regional and small banks are being over-restricted now by regulations that should have been just for the big, too big to fail banks, has been extended and is killing the small bank, and therefore, in a way, restricting lending. Even if there is demand for the loans, it's restricting lending. And so that's a very bad thing. And maybe GE thought, well, you know, with all these restrictions and these things like that, they've been labeled as a strategically important venture, and therefore more restrictions too. If we can shed the bank and get out from under all this, we can be a free company once more. So that may be one major incentive. The other is that, of course, GE have decided to introduce nanotechnology and electronic transponders and generators of information into almost every one of their products. So now, not only in a jet engine, but even in a household item that's come from GE, they will start to indicate when a fault is about to happen. Not that it has happened, that thing's broken, which is enough to find out what the fault is. That's pretty advanced. But now, even saying into the future, right, if in 2 hours' time this thing is going to stop because so-and-so is wearing out or breaking down. And that's going to be a major leap. They're introducing nanotechnology into old industrial technology. And that's going to be a major thing. And maybe they want to concentrate on that and feel more free to do that, and therefore get free of the restrictions that have been pushed on by all these really left-wing people like Dodd-Frank onto the banking industry. When it should have been the Fed. It shouldn't be Dodd-Frank. I mean, they should have reinstated Glass-Steagall, which to me was quite appalling. They allow banks to lend to the people and investing in the securities the banks are underwriting. They should have eliminated that, and they should have, as they said, the banks were too big to fail. They should have pruned them down. The big banks, not the little banks in the countryside. And so I think it has basically compounded the error, and GE is one country that said, enough's enough. We're leaving this banking industry.
During the financial crisis, I had friends that worked in smaller banks, and they were looking at me trying to understand what the problem was because everything was fine with them. Until, of course, the economy started going south later on. Then they really felt it. John, what keeps you up at night right now, worrying about? I mean, there's a lot of issues here, but is there anything particularly troubling right now to you?
Well, first of all, a lot of those banks you mentioned, a lot of them were quite successful.
Yes.
Even with the downturn economy, because they hadn't lent to property loans and they'd lent to careful businesses locally.
They held the loans. They held them.
Far better lending profiles than the big banks. What keeps me up, actually, is thinking about my next articles without them being overly depressive. I keep searching for something that's going to cheer people up, and the royal baby might be one. It's very depressing looking out. I mean, my greatest fear is that people say, well, governments can go on borrowing. Well, history is full of the fact that they can't. I mean, Greece is just one example. Cyprus is another. Argentina is another. I mean, they go on. Governments do lose faith. The market does lose faith in governments. And if we go on in America like this with totally irresponsible spending, there's going to come a time when people, and it happens suddenly, it's like pushing a glass of coffee or a cup of coffee towards the edge of the table. And it looks nearer and nearer, you'll think, gosh, if it goes any further, it's going to fall over. And it doesn't glide gently to the floor. It falls bang, and there's coffee stains all over the carpet. And that's what will happen if people lose faith in America and the US dollar. It will happen all of a sudden. You'd wake up one day and find the banks closed for 3 months or whatever it is. ATMs would be out of money. There'd be no cash. I mean, it would be a disastrous situation. And I see it approaching. Whether we do something between now and then and avert the disaster, I don't know. I hope and pray, but it keeps me awake at night, even for my own dollars. The small deposits I have, I mean, they just vanish. And so it's a very worrying thing, not just the financial hurt that happens when you lose your deposits and you can't get into the bank to get any money out, even if you've got any in there. But it's the civil unrest that results. That's the real worry.
Do we have John, do we have a governance problem in that, in days gone by, we had leaders in Britain like Winston Churchill, we had leaders like Ronald Reagan here in the United States that took on some of the heavier issues with the people, but all the issues we're talking about, I don't hear any politicians even raising. And why not? You can't solve problems unless you're debating them. Well, is there fundamentally a flaw that you can see?
Yes, I mean, it's not just that they won't debate them, they squash them even being mentioned. And when people do mention them, I mean, look at the row that's occurred between Senator Rand Paul and McCain. I mean, because he termed McCain one of the old people of the old thing that steered us down the hill, my gosh, McCain really lashed him, said he was the worst candidate. I mean, I've never seen such language come from people from officially the same side. In those days, we had leaders who were patriotic. It's like when I first came to Wall Street in 1969, most of the big firms were owned by partners. They were risking their own money, and they were in there for generations. They wanted their sons to be taking over in the bank and to have relationships with your son as a client and grandsons. And they saw it as a generational thing, that they were in this business, they were professionals, but they risked their own capital. Then in order to increase the capital for these huge amounts of underwritings, because the government was pushing more and more money into the system, so the deals went up in size and the banks needed extra capital to underwrite the deals. And so they became companies, and they were commanded by managers, not by partners. And the managers were interested in a high performance this quarter, or this year, so they get a whacking great bonus. And by 10 years' time, when the deal goes wrong, they're out and far away and sunning themselves in luxury and away from the problem. And that's why a lot of these loans went bad. The people had gone. And so whereas companies are now managed by managers rather than partners, the ethics have gone down completely, and countries are now in the same thing. Patriotism is almost a dead word. I mean, you're almost laughed at in a parliament or a congress if you say, oh, we must do this because it's right, or we must do this because it's in the national interest. They'll say, come on, my boy, think of the party. Are we going to get re-elected or not? That's what matters, not to hell with the country. And that's why you need single-term politicians who are not interested, once they've got elected, in being re-elected. They are then motivated to do their job, which is something for the nation, not for their party and themselves. I mean, how many of these politicians go in relatively poor and end up multi-millionaires, if not billionaires? Where do they get the money on the parliamentary wage? I just don't understand it. But it all looks rather fishy to me, or smells rather fishy. And so when you've got people motivated by money and personal success and out for the party and that sort of thing rather than the country, can you expect it to go anywhere else? It follows the same train as the companies. They're irresponsible managers, and now we've got irresponsible politicians. And it's hard, I mean, very hard for any leader. I mean, Margaret Thatcher slipped through the cracks. She wasn't one of the stars in the Conservative England. She did the clever thing. She kept her mouth shut. And she didn't give any indication where she really stood. Just a loyal conservative. And so this movement towards, well, we must have more women represented. It's looking bad for the party not to have women. We look anti-women. And so she was put in the cabinet as a woman, not because she was any good or they thought anything of her, but she was a woman with fair hair and a sort of dumb blonde thing. We'll have one blonde in there to stick out amongst all the men and show the Conservatives are pro-women. And, of course, they gave her a non-job, which was education. Now, in England at that time, education was run by the counties, not by the government. It's like all you had to do as the minister was keep the boat was being sailed by the crew of professionals. All you had to do was make sure they were on the right course and it kept sailing. They didn't have to do anything. So she was put in this non-job as a sort of figurehead, a woman figurehead. And of course, even then, she rather dangerously said, well, why should the country be paying for all the students in England to have a quarter of a pint of milk a day, as they did in the war for real reasons? Now we're in peace, why is it? And she almost lost her job because she suggested people should pay for the milk and rather than a taxpayer. And then people began to see who were close to her and were still patriots left, most of whom had served in the war, like Ari Neve, who was not only a valiant soldier from Colditz prison camp, the most difficult prison camp to escape from. These were people who'd served in the war, who'd seen leaders, and they saw the one thing Margaret Thatcher's got is she's a patriot. She really believes. When she says something, she believes it. So they got her in. And when she challenged for the leadership, then came all these other minnows to do a whale's job to challenge her. But she beat them all off and got elected. It was a resounding victory. And then, surprise, surprise, which surprised even some of the senior people who had voted for her, she actually started to do the things she promised to do, which was most unlike a modern politician. I mean, people were shocked that she actually meant what she said. And she started actually to do it. And it was, I was thrilled to be there because in Parliament at that time, one was so pleased to have some of these senior politicians and cabinet ministers utterly shocked that they were being made to do things they thought was just window dressing. And so there she survived, and she was the last. And then she was knifed down, not by the electorate, not even by the Conservative Party in a primary, but by the top lieutenants in her government, stabbed her down just like Caesar, in a sea of political blood knee deep. And that was the end of her, because the big professional politicians who wanted their jobs, they wanted just power. They didn't want power to do something for the country. They wanted power for themselves. And they knifed her down in a sea of blood. And that was the last. She and Ronald Reagan were the last of the Western politicians of that, leaders, real leaders. Now you're left with a whole lot of politicians, like managers. Leaders were like partners. Managers were like politicians. And now we're just full of politicians. I mean, everything our president does here, everything's a political thing. Nothing, you don't see anything motivated by the national interest, patriotism, or anything else.
I need to tell our listeners, they may not be aware, you were actually a consultant to Margaret Thatcher during that period too, right?
Well, a consultant. I was a member of Parliament. I mean, I did advise her on a number of issues and things like that, and being in her Praetorian Guard was relatively close to her because we were the young Praetorian Guard that really believed in what she was doing. And we were considered young recruits who were complete misfits in the party because we actually believed what we thought, what we said. And that was totally naive. We would consider these young people naive and can't get on with this. Just as you see in America today, how much are these young senators who like Rand and Cruz and Rubio and all, oh, he's only a first-term senator. How can he know how to run the country? I mean, thank God he's first time. He hasn't got infected by the system.
John, we're up against our hard line. We have to break. Is there a key message you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Yes. Vote. Get friends of yours to stand as single-term politicians and vote for them and get your friends to vote. It's the only solution that I see short of totalitarian government, and you don't want that.
John, how can people learn more about the work you do, where they can find your writings and follow your writings? Well, I'm
the lead article on the Pittsburgh Tribune Review Sunday edition, which is also on the internet, pittsburghtribunareview.com. And I'm also on the cover page of Euro-Pacific Capital, europacificcapital.net, Europac.net rather, on their website, basically. And occasionally I do broadcasts like with you and on CNBC and Fox and things like that occasionally, and radio broadcasts and various things like that. And I'm going to be lecturing at Lynn University this evening.
And as soon as you hang up, you may be on CNBC on Baby Watch, right?
Important issues. Important. Now, this will be a patriot that's coming.
They're going to call you for comment on it. John, we're going to have you back later in the year. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your insights with you, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure and a privilege.
Talk to you again. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.